Hi, welcome to Lighthouse Living Room, and our time together tonight is going to be pretty, how can I say, intense, since we're going to be talking about the reality of demon activity or demonic influence in our lives and around our lives. Tonight, if we have a title for tonight, it'd be Understanding Our Enemy, how demons operate or how they actually occupy space and what they do and how they do it. So tonight, this is a time where it'd be really good for you to have a notepad and something to write with, so that when we go over Scripture, you'll be able to see it and go back and read it again, simply for two reasons. One, this is a new reality for most of you that are listening tonight. A new reality in the fact that I believe strongly that that many of the maladies, if I call them sicknesses or whatever you want to call it, in the church, in the people of God, in saints of God, are deliverable. In other words, they can be eradicated. That includes everything from cancer to tumors to lung issues, all of that stuff. I do believe that. Now, the problem is what has transpired in Christendom is that kind of like here in our valley, in the Ojai Valley, so that you know and understand this, is that when you're in a position where you're having all of this oppression there all of the time, and it has a tendency to wear on you, and then what happens eventually, and I don't mean this to be try to be coy or naive or something along that line, but when it's there for so long, you begin to accept it as our reality. I do not believe that we can do that as Christians. We are at war. I shared with you a week ago, talking about the different, actually the last 2 weeks, the motif or actually how Christians believe activity of the dark side is kind of benign. In other words, the war is over, there is no war, there's nothing for us to do. Just this Sunday, when I was discussing Joshua's battle in the Southern Campaign, which we will get into in a very real way here momentarily, maybe not tonight, but next week for sure, that there is so much that was going on, if you will, in that battle. When they did exactly as God asked them to do. Now remember that the book of Joshua is a playbook for today. In other words, what we see happening in Joshua flips over into our reality, into the 21st century, first century, 21st century. And what I'm going to be discussing tonight in great detail is understanding the enemy. And this is something that here's a statement I want to read to you so that you get this in your brain. Some of you asked a question a couple of weeks ago in regards to AI. And AI was the name of a town. It was not artificial intelligence, just so you know. But AI, Joshua did something he shouldn't have done. And in doing what he did, and you can go back a couple of Sundays ago when I was talking about that, and what he did is he released some of the people from their, how can I say it, their obligation to keep pressure on it. This Sunday I talked about all of the kings that were captured in the Southern Campaign, the 5 major kings. One of them was the king of Jerusalem. And they had to be put, the feet of the commanders had to be put on their necks, which sounds really brutal and ugly, but the fact is that is that's relational to spiritual matter in regards to how we react to the things that are around us and the pressures we're feeling. As I was saying, in Oakview and in Ojai and et cetera, we're so used to this darkness, we've accepted it as normal, and that's not normal, and we should be fighting against it, we should be pushing back against it. But understanding our enemy, it says, now, when we know what we're dealing with, and that is demonic forces or demons. The enemy knows that we know, and that is when things begin to happen. In other words, that's when we begin to see results. And the term that's used is called deliverance. Now, much of what we do in the reality of demonic forces, we need to understand that there's a lot of people out there in the church, in the Christian community, that doesn't believe that demons are real. And I will assure you, full straight up, 100%, that demons are very real and demonic forces are very real. How do we know that? Because Jesus talks about them a lot. And we're going to take a look at that tonight through Scripture, and we're going to explain as we go. I'm going to try to go slow. It may take me 2 weeks to go through this simply because we have to know the truth. And the truth says, when you know the truth will literally set you free. Not only set you free in the realm of reality, but in the spiritual realm. Here we find in the reality of demons in the idea from the book of Ephesians that Paul was writing to the church at Ephesus. Ephesians 6:12. Every one of us know it, but here's some things that we need to know about it. Verse 12 says this, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood." This is where we get it wrong. This is where we get really into it. We think that we're dealing with something that is tangible, real, pinch and ouch, we feel it. That's not what I'm talking about. We're not dealing with or struggling with flesh and blood, but against rulers, against the power, against the world forces of this darkness, against spiritual forces of wickedness in heavenly places. Now, heavenly places is not talking about in heaven. It's talking about in heavens that surround us, that which is in the air, the principalities and powers of the air. Now, what do you mean by that, Pastor? Well, we're going to see this now in probably played out a little bit more specifically as we go to this next piece of Scripture. Luke chapter 4, verses 31 through 41. Now, in verse 31, he said, this is Jesus now. This is a result, Dr. Luke speaking through the eyes, first person, saw it happen in reality. So this is not a story that was retold. This is something that he saw with his own eyes. Now, and he came down to Capernaum, the city of Galilee, and it was teaching them on the Sabbath, which would be what we would consider our Saturday. I mean, many people don't believe that, but it could have been Friday. But I'm just saying, it was not Sunday. So here's the deal. And they were amazed at his teaching, for his message was with authority. Jesus speaking now. In the synagogue, verse 33, synagogue, there was a man possessed. Now, we mentioned this the other day. Now, I want you to one of the first things I talked about, that possessed means that someone is completely taken over by a demonic spirit. I'm not convinced that that is true 100% of the time, because the word that's being used here means traumatized. It does not mean possessed. It means traumatized. He said there was a man traumatized by the spirit of an unclean demon. And Dionysia, which is demonic in sense that he cried out with a loud voice, "Let us alone." Verse 34. "What business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth?" Now, here's the fascinating thing about what demonic presences know when they're operating through an individual's life. Just like I told you about the little gal that was living on our property in a trailer, and she seemed to be under the influence of alcohol all the time. Well, it was a spirit that was under there. She had not a drop, but she acted as if she was totally drunk. And that was a demonic spirit that was oppressing her. Here in this case, it says that this demonic presence revealed himself through this individual by saying, "Let us alone," which means there was more than one. Now, what was interesting about that is that what business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? But I know who you are, the Holy One of God. And then Jesus rebuked him, saying, be quiet, and come out of him. Now, what happens is that when an individual becomes so relationally close to these demonic forces, they operate through him like a marionette or like a puppet. And they will speak and they will do whatever is prompted to them through their mind. And they will do that. This is one of the things that we see when we talk about people who are mentally ill. Much of what we see is, today anyway, much of what we see is not traumatized people by demonic forces, but usually medication or pharmakia. Pharmakia is what we call drugs, if you will, that are operating through an individual, and it is something that opens the door, which we'll talk about, hopefully tonight we'll be able to talk about a little bit, which opens the door for that traumatization to take place, because it frees, listen carefully, it frees the mind to be taken by whatever influence is more powerful. I hope that makes sense. Now, so let us alone. But Jesus rebuked him, saying, be quiet and come out of him. And when the demon had thrown him down in the midst of the people, in other words, this was a physical reaction most of the time when someone was being so traumatized by the enemy that to release them, they actually physically would be thrown to the ground, and they would writhe like they were having some kind of a seizure. And so he's come out of him without doing him any harm, because what they would do, they would try to destroy the vessel in which they were using when they hit the ground, and they would try to strike themselves against a rock or about a wall. We see people doing this all the time, and here's a great example, where they take themselves and they go to a wall and they start hitting their head on the wall. I mean, I've seen it. I know it's very real. And people are not in their, careful about what I'm saying, in their right mind when that's going on. Now, here's something that we need to understand. And an amazement came upon all of them when they began talking to one another, saying, what is this message? For with the authority and power does he command unclean spirits, and they come out. And they report, and then the report about him was spreading into every locality in the surrounding district. Verse 38 is revealing, because look what it says next. Then he got up and left the synagogue and entered Simon's home. Now Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever. Now, don't get me wrong, she was not possessed by a devil or by a demon or being traumatized. She was sick. She was having a high fever, and they asked him to help her. And standing over her, he rebuked, in other words, he spoke to the fever and said, leave her, and it left her, and she immediately got up and waited on them. Now, I don't know about you, but when people are sick, you have to know the difference between whether this is organic or spiritual. In other words, something that's happening in the natural or in the spiritual. You follow so far? Now look what he goes on. And standing over her, he rebuked the fever, and it left her. And she immediately got up and waited on them. Now, verse 40. This is 38 and 39. Verse 40 says, while the sun was setting, all those who had any who were sick with various diseases, now this is natural, this is sickness, organic, he brought them, and laying hands on each one of them, he was healing them. In other words, they were recovering from what was happening. Demonic spirits also were coming out of many, shouting, you are the Son of God. The only way that that person would have known that he was the Son of God is if a dark spirit was witnessing to his spirit, and he had to respond, because they can't stay in the same place. And he said, you're the Son of God. Then he would rebuke them, and he would not allow them to speak, because they knew that he was the Christ. Now here's another indication of understanding what demon or demonic spirits do and the traumatization of individuals. In Acts chapter 8, verses 5 through 8, this is Acts 8, 5 through 8. Here's another one. Look at here. Philip went down to the city of Samaria, began proclaiming Christ to them. The crowds with one accord were giving attention to what was said by Philip, as they heard and saw the signs which he was performing. So signs would mean that there was something going on while he was there, and he was doing what God had told him to do. Now remember, gifts of the Spirit are not for us to play magic tricks with. It's only when God speaks to you to use them in regards to a situation. You follow me with that? Be sure to understand that it's a case of knowing when God is speaking for you to do it and not. And so they heard and saw signs which he was performing. For in the case of many who had unclean spirits, which seemed to be a real problem back in those days, and probably the same today, they were coming out of them shouting with a loud voice, for many who had been paralyzed and lame were healed. So the result of this traumatization or this activation of dark spirit within an individual's life created in them, because Jesus was not present, in other words, his spirit was not there, they were pretty much doing whatever they wanted. And so there was much rejoicing in that city because of what was going on. This was in Samaria. Now, what do we know about Samaria? So let's go back and think about that for a moment. Samaria was a very dark place. Jews would not associate with them. They were considered half-breeds. They were considered tainted, if you will, and they would not associate with them. But Philip went down, and man, everything in the world was happening. This is one of the reasons, listen carefully what I'm about to say, this is one of the reasons when people go to third world countries where they have not heard of Jesus, they don't have the TV and radio and all the other stuff, and they go into dark places, and the Spirit of God moves, everyone starts coming to Jesus. All kinds of crazy stuff happen. Oh, crazy. I'm going to say godly things start to happen where people are saved. People get healed. Goiters fall off of necks. Jaundice goes away. Blindness goes away. Crippledness goes away. It just happens that way because that is what God does when he is operating according to the Word of God and according to the individual as they are applying the Word of God to situations that the Lord has spoke to them to do. Acts chapter 11 and 12 goes on and says this, God was performing extraordinary miracles by the hands of Paul, so that handkerchiefs or aprons were even carried from his body to the sick, and the disease left them, and the evil spirits went out. This is what we base when we come and ask for a prayer cloth here in our church. When I ask for we anoint a piece of linen, apron, if you will, handkerchief, and we anoint that, and we pray over it, and we send it out, and we see things happen. I've told you the story 100 times. A little gal that lived in Central Valley, outside of Redding, had a next door neighbor. She attended her church. Her name was Patty Mormon, sweetheart. Not that she was a Mormon. Her last name just happened to be Mormon. Anyway, but Patty. And Patty had a lady next door to her who was bleeding from her female parts, and she was in her 80s. She was basically becoming anemic, and it was killing her. She had been bleeding for over a year and a half. Came and asked me when she heard about this idea of handkerchiefs being anointed, which I did even then back in the 80s, and I gave that to her. We prayed over it. She took it home. I said, let me know what happens. She calls me back the very next morning. She said, my next door neighbor has no more bleeding issues. In fact, she said she's never felt better. And so I know this stuff works. And I should say stuff. I know when you do what God asks you to do, it works. So taking all of that in, let that soak in a little bit, the personality of demons or demonic forces. Let me give you some insights to that. Are you ready to write? In Matthew chapter 12, verses 43 and 44, listen to what is being said here and understand the concept of a spiritual entity, okay? Not deity, well, not deity in the form that we think it is, but in the fact that this is a spiritual entity, all right? Now, verse 43 of chapter 12 of Matthew, look what it says. Now, when an unclean spirit goes out of a man, in other words, what we were witnessing in Acts, when it comes out of a man through waterless places seeking rest, and it does not find it. Then it says, I will return to my house from which I've come, and when it comes, it will find it unoccupied, swept, and put in order. Now, this is interesting. Understand when an unclean spirit comes out of a man, it will seek to attach himself, or it will try to attach itself to something else. This is one of the reasons why the revelation that we got when Jesus sent all of those different spirits into pigs, swine, and then the swine went nuts, crazy, and they all went over the hill and chased him out of town. So that's another story. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Mark 1, 23 and 24 goes on to say this. Just then there was a man in the synagogue with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, saying, what business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth? We just read this. Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. The personality of a demon is that it will recognize you as a person of God. It will speak to you in that regard. It will give you attention. If there's someone that is being traumatized by a demonic presence of some kind, when you go into the room, I will guarantee you two things will happen. One, it will recognize you, and it will stare you down. It actually will stare you down. And I know a lot of people don't understand that, but it's true. It will happen. James 2:19, you believe that God is one, you do well. The demons also believe and shudder. In other words, they're scared to death of the person of Christ, and especially someone who has a spirit in them. Mark 3:11 and 12. Whenever an unclean spirits saw him, speaking of Jesus, they would fall down before him and shout, you are the Son of God, and earnestly warned them not to tell who he was. In other words, shut your mouth. And they would obey him. They would stop their ranting. But they have to confess that he is who he is, because that is the presence of God in their presence. And they will confirm it, and they will do it over and over and over again. Mark 5:7 through 9. And shouting with a loud voice, he said, what business do you have with each other, Jesus? This is, again, Mark in Mark 5. Son of the Most High, I implore you, by God, do not torment me. For he had been saying to him, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. And he was asking him, what is your name? And he said to him, my name is Legion, for we are many. In other words, there was at least 100. Fascinating thing there. That's another story altogether. So that's the personality of demonic presence. They will react to you. They will react to the presence of God. If you are not a threat, they will ignore you. In other words, the Spirit of God's not living in you the way it should. And they will most definitely ignore you. I pray that here at the Lighthouse, everyone who has the presence of God in them will be a threat to them, and they will react. I pray that way. Now, here's the next thing that we want to go to. We looked at personalities of demons, if you will, or demonic entities. Let's take a look at the form of demonic entities. In Luke 3, verse 7. So he began saying to the crowds, again, this is Luke 3, verse 7. So he began saying to the crowds who were going out to be baptized by him, you brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? In other words, he is looking at them as if, and of course in Luke, this is kind of interesting. This is John the Baptist baptizing. He's the one that recognized them for what they were. In another place he calls them some other things, but hopefully we'll get to that. In Luke 10:19, behold, I have given you the authority to tread on serpents, scorpions, over all the power of the enemy, and nothing will injure you. This is where people, I should say Christians, get messed up. They're fearful of the enemy, but here it says, and nothing will injure you. Nothing. In other words, nothing will harm you. Revelations chapter 9, verses 1 through 10 goes on to say this. And then the fifth angel sounded and saw a star from heaven which had fallen to the earth, and the key to the bottomless pit was given to him. He opened the bottomless pit, and smoke went out of the pit like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by the smoke of the pit. Then out of the smoke came locusts upon the earth, and the power was given them, and the scorpions of the earth have power. And they were told not to hurt the grass of the earth, nor any green thing, nor any tree, but only the men who did not have the seal of God on their foreheads. And they were not permitted to kill anyone, but to torment them for 5 months. And the torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings a man. And those days men will seek death and not find it, and they will long to die, and the death flees from them. That's pretty scary stuff. Verse 7 goes on to say this: the appearance of the locusts were like horses prepared for battle, and on their heads appeared to the crowns of like gold, and their faces were like the faces of men. Their hair was like the hair of women, and their teeth were like the teeth of lions. And they had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots, many horses rushing to battle. And they have tails like scorpions and stings, and their tails is the power to hurt men for 5 months. If you have not listened and gone back into your archives and listened to my explanation of Daniel chapter 7, chapter 9, chapter 12, and the 70th week, you need to go back and listen to that seminar. Listen to all of it. That it will explain what I just read to you in detail. Revelation 16, 3 and 4, again, is what the form of a demonic presence would look like. The second angel, this is Revelation chapter 16, verse 3 and 4. The second angel poured out his bowl into the sea, and it became like blood, that of a dead man, that every living thing in the sea died. And the third angel poured out his bowl into the rivers and springs of water, and they became blood. These are, if you will, the forms of what demonic presences look like. But now, takes us to another level. I'm reading all of this to you, not to scare you. Remember, we have authority over the enemy here on the planet. If you're a child of the living God, and you are given over to the Holy Spirit, not the dark spirit, you have control and power over what the enemy would do. So there should be no fear in that, even though many of us operate in more fear than we should. Now, there's another thing that we want to talk about called the stronghold of demons or demonic forces. In Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 20, I'm going to read that, and I want to share with you that part I was just talking about. They came to the other side of the sea into a country of the Gerasenes. When they got out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs, in other words, there were tombs all along the shoreline where these guys got out. And in that tomb was a man who had lived there for many years, who was totally tormented by demonic presences. Follow me now. When they got out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him, and he and his dwelling among the tombs. And no one was able to bind him anymore, even with a chain. In other words, he was these dark spirits would come upon him, and he would become supernaturally strong. And because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken into pieces, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. Constantly, day and night, he was screaming among the tombs and the mountains, gnashing himself with stones. Again, remember what I said. What happens to these demonic forces want the entity in which they are tormenting to kill itself or to destroy it so that it would be banished to hell. Follow me now? Seeing Jesus from a distance, now from a distance, he knew who it was. He ran and bowed down before him. How can this guy that just has been trying to destroy himself, cut himself with rocks and stuff, how does that work? All of a sudden he sees him, and he goes and he recognizes who he is. He says, Son of the Most High God, I implore you by God, do not torment me. Because he's talking about the traumatization of his life through these entities. Do not torment me. There's others that are already tormenting me. I don't need any more. And he said, and he had been saying to him, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. And he was asking him, what is your name? Follow me now. And he said, my name is Legion, for we are many. And he began to implore him earnestly not to send them out of the country. So there was a large herd of swine feeding nearby in the mountain. The demons implored him, saying, send us into the swine so that we may enter them. So we may, in other words, torment them. Jesus gave them permission, and coming out, the unclean spirit entered the swine, and the herd rushed down a steep bank into the sea, about 2,000 of them. So legion in this case was 2,000, and they were drowned in the sea. Now this is where it gets ugly. The herdsmen ran away and reported that in the city and in the country, and when the people came out to see what had happened, they came to Jesus and observed the man who had been demon-possessed, sitting down, clothed and in his right mind, and the very man who had the legion, they became frightened. Now, two things you need to notice here. You probably didn't catch this, but these were swine. Jews had nothing to do with pigs, period. So he was far enough away from Jerusalem, or from Israel, if you will, proper, that he was in the range of what we would call Samaritans, or Gentiles, or other than Jews. Those who had seen described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and all about the swine. And so they began to implore him to leave their region. In other words, get out of town, dude. You just killed half of our livelihood. He said, and anyway, it was getting crazy. And so he got into the boat, and the man who the demon possessed was imploring that he might accompany him. But he did not let him in, but said to him, "Go home to your people and report to them the great things the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And then he went away and began to proclaim in Decapolis. And Decapolis was a very large town. That was great things that Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. So let's go on to the next one. 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 5. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. Okay, now we're talking about character. We're talking about what the demons look like, how to recognize, understand what they're doing. For the weapons of our warfare are not flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. We call that strongholds. And I'm going to talk about strongholds and how they enter into individuals' lives, even though we don't think we have any influence. And they come up against the knowledge of God, and we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Now, 2 Corinthians 10, 3 and 5. You need to read that several times to get the crux of it. Understanding that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal or natural or normal. We don't have a sword, gun, for lack of a better term, or rock or whatever. It's spiritual in nature. So what happens, and for the destruction, it says, for the destruction of fortress or the tearing down of strongholds. Now, how do these demonic presences or this trauma or these influences come into an individual's life? Now, this is going to be hard for some of you to understand, but needless to say, it is true. It does happen. Where does your mean streak come from? Why do you get angry out of the clear blue? Why do some people just make you go wacko? And I'm excluding family. Those other things that I'm talking about, here are some things you need to understand. Write these down if you don't understand them, and if you have a question about it, let me know, and we'll talk about it. Now, the entrance of a demonic or dark force into the life, any life, and that would include Christians, because if you remember, we've been talking about what happened with Joshua when he made a deal with the people that he was supposed to destroy. They went into the mountains and hid themselves, and then they would come out and torment Israel. Same is true of those things that have an entrance, or we've given an okay to come into our lives, or maybe didn't even know that it was there. How do we know that? Because of prenatal influences. Prenatal means things that from in the womb. A lot of people, and don't get me wrong, not everybody has these influences, but some do. How does that happen? Mom doing some things that they shouldn't have done. Father doing something that they shouldn't have done. drug addiction, and all those other things. There's so much that we could talk about here, but I don't want to go into that yet because I've got so many to cover tonight. We're running out of time already. Number 2, emotional crisis. Something that happened that was traumatic in your life that allowed something to take place. You were hit, you were brutalized, you were robbed, you had an accident of some kind. There's all kinds of things you can have, emotional crisis. And then, of course, there's works of the flesh. What are the works of the flesh? Pornography, other influences, incest, all kinds of weird stuff like that, works of the flesh. Then there's occultism. That is when we purposely seek out dark sources. You know, a lot of people used to make a big deal about the Ouija board. Let me tell you what's the real deal. You cannot, for the life of me, I don't know why anybody would want to conjure up or have some kind of dark force come and visit you. It's bad enough when you're a Christian and you have what they call night terrors. I've experienced that. We'll get into that down the road, and I can explain to you what happened to me. There's witchcraft. In other words, a lot of people don't believe that just watching a movie or being involved with someone, that witchcraft is real. Well, it's very real. And there's no such thing as white witches. You can say whatever you want. There's no such thing as a white witch. They're not green, they're not purple. They're black, they're dark. And it's just what it is. We have drugs, music, and movies. All of these things, music enters the ear gate, movies enter the eye gate, and drugs enter the body, one way or another, orally, intravenously. False religions, what's another way that you can have some kind of demonic influence in your life. A lot of people don't believe that, and it can go down to something that's as benign as just something that happened within the church, for instance. It's just crazy stuff. Ungodly soul ties. That would be in regard to both men and women who are having sex or having anything that has to do with sex. I mean, a lot of people tell me, well, I've never had sex. Well, everything else you did was about everything but that. And that creates a soul tie, creates a chemistry that begins to happen at the base of the skull, and it puts out a pheromone that makes you feel good. And so you seek it out. Ungodly soul ties comes from that, especially from sexual activity. Pronouncements and vows, V-O-W-S, vows. There's a lot of stuff out there that a lot of people don't realize that you can get involved with that will create an atmosphere where you've allowed the enemy to come in. Now, so how do we defeat some of these things? And I think I'm going to have to, hard to believe I've already blown through 40 minutes. Let's go through this one. How do we defeat the demonic activity? These are some things that we need to understand. 1 John 3:8. The one who practices sin is of the devil, and the devil has sinned from the beginning. The Son of God appeared for this purpose, to destroy the works of the devil. On Thursday nights, we've been studying 1 John. Last week, we talked about this in particular. Why are we here? The Son of God appeared for this purpose, to destroy the works of the devil. And he said to you and me, to us, greater things shall you do than I have done while I was here on the planet. Now, how can that possibly be? He did some pretty amazing stuff. My point that I'm making is that he's trying to tell us something. Do what I've done, and these things will take place. He's telling us, cast out the demonic forces, cause these things to leave, tell them to leave some people alone. They have to listen to you. What happens when they saw Jesus? What happens when they see a Christian? When somebody that's got the Spirit of God actually living in them? I mean, the reality of the fact that they are a source of God in regards to that person of Jesus living in them, they will respond to you. Now, Colossians 2:13 through 15. Andrea's having us go through Colossians. Now, this is chapter 2, verse 13. When you were dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he made you alive together with him, having forgiven us all of our transgressions, having canceled out the certificate of debt consisting of decrees against us. Decrees, that's a vow, which is hostile to us. And he takes it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. When he has disarmed the rulers and authorities, principalities and powers, he has made a public display of them. That's what happens when you see people get released from an unclean spirit, having triumphed over them, through him, through Jesus. Now, that is something we need to understand. There is something going on in the reality of what life is, and we must understand that in him is everything. Outside of him is nothing. Darkness is out here. In him is light. In him is truth. Outside of him is chaos. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 9. But we do see him who was made a little while lower than the angels, namely Jesus, because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. He's already sold this. The motif that I had shared with you a couple weeks ago, where some of the Christian churches believe that everything's over, we don't have to fight anymore. Au contraire, we do have to fight. Why? Because Jesus said we must maintain the fight. Joshua talks about that. Chapter 12. Must maintain the fight. Now, Hebrews 2, 14 through 15. Therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise also partook of the same, that through death he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is, the devil, and might free those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all of their lives. That is another indication of Jesus not living in you the way it should be living in you, which is what I'm talking about when I make a point of saying that he needs to be in you. You need to believe in his authority, and you need to practice his authority, but only when he tells you to, not just because you want to. There's a difference. Revelations 1, 17 and 18. When I saw him, I fell at his feet like a dead man, and he placed his right hand on me, saying, do not be afraid. I am the first and the last, the living one. And I was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore. And I have the keys of death and of hell. So all of that being said, all of that I'm talking about tonight is giving you if you will, a understanding of the dark forces, what their character and personality is like, and that they are defeated. Next week, we're going to be talking about casting out the demons, if you will. We'll say it whatever you want, casting them out. In other words, we are going to proclaim and deliver those that are being oppressed by the enemy. Now, do you think that's possible? I'm serious. I'm asking a question. Do you think that's possible? Do you think it's possible to, how can I say it, cast out oppressive spirits? If the first thing that came to your mind says no, then I'm going to have you think that through a little bit more. In the book of Matthew, the book of Mark, in Ephesians, talks about all of those things, and we're going to be talking about its protective armor. We're going to be talking about Satan's judgment and the 7 steps of judgment that Satan is under as we stand right now. He is condemned already. Jesus said it. I'll say it. He is condemned. But there are things that you can do that he said we need to do because he commanded us to do it. So thinking that the war is over, thinking that there's nothing else for us to do on the planet is not true. What is true is that we are to walk in the truth as he is in the truth and as we are in the truth, and that the light that Jesus gives us to see things in a spiritual sense, not flesh and blood, not skin and bones, but spiritually speaking, so that we can generate, if you will, an atmosphere of deliverance around us. And I guarantee you what's going to happen is that you're going to have people respond to you in ways that are unusual and strange, in the fact that they will seek you out for prayer. They will seek you out, but you have to remind them, it's not me, it is thee. It is him. And you're going to present to them what it is to understand what I'm speaking about tonight and practice it in a way, and you will learn in the next 2 to 3 weeks how to do that. Now, why do I say that? It's because a strong church, or a church that knows who the presence of evil is, the presence of evil knows that you know, and that's when everything starts to happen the way it's supposed to. In other words, it cannot stay in the presence of people who are illuminated by the light of Jesus. He cannot stay in the presence of an individual who is acting out his faith by declaring freedom to those that are in captivity. Well, that's enough for tonight. I'm sure that I've overwhelmed you with everything I've talked about, but my point that I'm making tonight, understand that there are demons and they know who you are, but you need to know who they are. Remember that you need to understand what their personality is like and how you deal with them. And then we're going to be talking about next week, casting out protective armor, Satan's judgment. See you next week. God bless. May the Lord bless you. Be bold. It's time to take action, especially if you're following us here at the Lighthouse. It's time to take action. Good night from Lighthouse Living Room. Blessings.